This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources. Consistent with its Running Right process, Alpha is an energy company committed to being a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward. We fuel progress around the world. More information at alphanr.com.
The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Richmond. We have the benefit here around Capitol Square in Richmond and have many great reporters who report for television, for radio, and for print media. And among those reporters, we have some who are analysts. And Jeff Shapiro from the Richmond Times-Dispatch is not simply a reporter, but someone who has all kinds of great sources, I'm sure, and is an analyst who writes a column as well as from time to time doing some regular reporting. And Jeff, we really appreciate your being back on This Week in Richmond. Our viewers may already be following you on Twitter, or they may be looking at your column that appears almost every Sunday. We appreciate your being on to talk with us about some of the issues. And let me start with this question. Is the General Assembly still in session?
Well, thank you for having me, David. And it's a good question. It may not be of particular relevance to the people whose opinions really count, ordinary
right.
Virginians.
Yes.
But it's certainly an opportunity for Democrats and Republicans, those preoccupied with the process, to talk about how peculiar, if not dysfunctional, state government seems to be. You know, of course, the issue here is, did the legislature, as Republicans allege, illegally and in an unconstitutional manner conclude its business on the 17th of August, all in the interest of temporarily saving Governor McAuliffe's appointment to the Supreme Court and to prevent Republicans from attempting again to come up with a congressional redistricting plan that might satisfy the courts. Long story short, there is now it will be up to 3 judges to craft a new congressional map. This is not something Republicans wanted to happen, to occur. They're thinking not just about congressional lines, but the implications of this continuing legal battle for a separate lawsuit that contests House of Delegates boundaries. The Democrats are relatively confident that they're going to prevail in that litigation too. Should they, it's very likely that the remedy, to use one of those terms that lawyers use, would include a special election for the House of Delegates in 2016. The significance of it being a presidential election year when turnout peaks 70% or more, and as a result of this more robust, broader participation, the large D Democratic reflex of the state strengthens. So if you are looking at your Republican majority, as Bill Howell is, and worrying about the possibility of a special election in 2016, could the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she may be, have long and strong coattails that might bring in 10 or 12 new Democratic legislators? If that were the case, instead of a 68-32 House of Delegates, we might have a 55-45 House of Delegates, or maybe even narrower. The point is, the Republicans, and we were reminded of this at that special session, at the special session with that surprise move to adjourn, are playing a defensive game.
As some of our viewers may recall, way back in the regular session, the lines there could have been a new legislation introduced then. It was put off then. It didn't happen in April at the reconvene time. And some are already suggesting that if the courts require the House districts to be redrawn, it may get done sooner in the year than it happened in the congressional, for fear of leaving it to a special session in which there could be potentially an abrupt adjournment.
Well, keep in mind, and this is how we get back to this Supreme Court appointment, the Republicans, and I can understand this, don't want to redraw these lines. And the Republicans have been dragging their feet on redistricting, if you catch my drift, for as long as they can. Their intention is to preserve the extant lines for as long as they can. And this means preserving their power as long as they can. Now, 2 weeks before the legislature met in special session, the Republican caucuses of the House and Senate announced that they would reject Judge Roush, Karen Roush, for the Supreme Court, because they said the governor had not consulted with them, and they feel that Rossi Alston, who's an appellate court judge, would be a superior pick. I think it's pretty clear the Republicans took Roush as a hostage in hopes of forcing the governor to retreat on his call to the legislature that it returned to Richmond on the 17th. What the Republicans perhaps had not anticipated is that the federal courts, overseeing all of this, did not grant the Republicans the requested extension.
Yes, right.
So suddenly they had a hostage and nothing with which to bargain. So they had to kind of go through the motions of looking like they were going to be dispensing of this hostage. And that's why the Senate Democrats, thanks to one Republican vote, John Watkins, a retiring centrist Republican from Powhatan, were able to force this disputed conclusion of the legislature.
Well, tell our viewers right now that we're having this conversation on the last day of August, 2 weeks after that special session. And in your column that appeared yesterday, you hinted at the possibility that, from what you were hearing, the fire may die down on this Supreme Court appointment. Are you standing by what you wrote in the paper?
Point being that between now and January, roughly a half a year, a lot could happen. There might be a change in the partisan control of the Senate. It's going to be a legislative session in which a full 2-year budget will be introduced. And that money, and there's expected to be a lot of it as the economy continues to improve, these could be very effective bargaining chips for Republican votes for the Roush confirmation.
The discussion we've already had about the drawing of the districts, there's been a push on the part of some, perhaps a minority, to try to get some changes in the way the redistricting is done every 10 years. Do you see any hopes that might occur, or is this just an anomaly of what's happening now and So we fast forward to the next census, and it still will be a highly partisan redistricting. Which way do you?
Well, redistricting has never been for the faint of heart. The Democrats, when they were in the majority, could be ruthless, and proudly so. The Republicans have been ruthless and proudly so, but have also had the advantage of computer technology. These districts can be drawn with frightening precision. For Republicans, the problem, and I don't think that's an inappropriate word here, is how to preserve some toehold on power when the state, largely because of growth in population and significant demographic change, is becoming more reliably democratic. So the Republicans are doing, of course, what the Democrats had done, but again with great precision, drawing districts to create a certain result. The problem, of course, for the Republicans now is that there's another branch of government that has some reservations about what they've been doing. And they've lost one challenge to congressional boundaries. It's entirely possible they could lose on this challenge to House of Delegates districts, though Republicans say there are some important but nuanced differences between the two cases. And that leads them, Republicans, to believe that they have a good chance of winning this suit. It'll be any day now before we hear from the three-judge panel that is hearing this case. But there is clearly a growing sense around the country, and there have been Supreme Court cases that have, shall I say, reinforced the public's optimism that somehow this made-to-order form of redistricting can be done away with, and that states can be pressured to be more objective in drawing legislative boundaries. A lot's been going on around the country, in Arizona, in Florida. There will be yet another lawsuit in Virginia challenging legislative boundaries, but under the state constitution, not under the federal constitution. And the conditions for redistricting are very narrow in the state constitution. That districts should be contiguous, that they should line up one against the other, but they should be compact. And I think if one were to look at a House map or a Senate map, some of these districts would seem anything but compact. All of this is part of a continuing effort, certainly by Democrats, but by growing numbers of independents and disaffected Republicans, too, to pressure the legislature to come up with a more reasonable form of political cartography.
You made a passing reference a few moments ago about the upcoming election this November, with all the attention being given to national candidates. A significant number of Virginians may have forgotten at this point in time, August and September. They'll be reminded that there is an election for the General Assembly. As you reflect on that election coming up, with the current districts drawn as they are in the House and the Senate, what's your best guess, opinion on how the General Assembly will be made up? Will it be 21-19, 22-18? Will it be 2020? What's the Shapiro take on the upcoming election?
Well, the conventional wisdom, for what it's worth, is that there will not be significant changes in the makeup of the House of Delegates, that it will retain its Republican majority. That said, there are a number of House districts represented by Republicans that went to Barack Obama. But during presidential elections,
right,
when turnout is at its highest, the one advantage that the Republicans have, and it's a significant one heading into this cycle, is that this is the bottom of the trough when it comes to turnout. There will be very, very, very low turnouts, and that will work to the advantage of the Republican majority in the House. The Senate, the districts are roughly 2.5 times the size of a single House district. This is where the Democrats are concentrating most of their money and attention. They need to flip 2 seats for absolute control of the legislature, go from 19 to 21, or tie it up and then rely on the tie-breaking vote of a Democratic Lieutenant Governor, Ralph Northam. If the Democrats take back the Senate, that would certainly provide the governor with some important traction heading into an important point in his tenure. In January, rather than December, he's going to introduce the only 2-year budget that's his and his alone. This will be the fiscal foundation of the McAuliffe legacy. The more help he has in the legislature, the better.
You know, in a recent column that you wrote about the healthcare issues and thinking about the upcoming session and whether that would be an issue. And with the governor's address to the joint money committees, the column that you've written, Sean Connaughton, who's now the CEO of the Hospital and Healthcare Association, was on a recent show talking about the plight of the hospitals, particularly rural hospitals in Virginia. Do you see any possibility that there may be a breakthrough on this? I believe actually in the column on August 30th, you mentioned that may be possible.
Let's see what happens with the Senate. You know, these low turnouts could help the Republicans retain their majority. That would not work, clearly not work to McAuliffe's advantage. If the Democrats were to take back the Senate, if federal judges were to throw out the House plan and order special elections, a lot of moving parts here, David.
Right.
A lot of moving parts here. That might improve chances, at least for a go. The hospitals are very concerned about the health, particularly of their rural hospitals. According to the governor, roughly half are now in deficit, and roughly half have been in deficit for several years. What will the solution to this problem be? Will it be some type of a provider tax? One hears talk about that. I remember Jerry Beliles pushed that, or informally pushed it. It didn't go anywhere. Doug Wilder tried it. It was a disaster. Right. And of course, Republicans like to think of themselves as anti-taxers. Would they go along with some type of a provider tax, even if it was something sought by the industry to stabilize the budgets of these hospitals?
Yeah, all the moving parts is going to make it quite interesting. You know, as many people would say, however they express it, we all have clay feet. There's personal matters that come up. What kind of guidelines does Jeff Shapiro use in trying to determine whether this is information about elected officials that should be shared with the public, or whether that's just information that should be left as personal? And sometimes it appears that different people, reporters and even analysts, look at this differently. So how do you wrestle with whether you speak out, write about, tweet about something, or just leave it alone?
Well, I'm going to have to answer that question with a question. What exactly do you have in mind?
Well, there have been recent matters pertaining to individuals allegedly having some personal matters. Now you've got me on the spot now, don't you? I thought I had you there. But with regards to whether it's the Ashley Madison site or this or that, are there things that one hears about, occasionally reads about, but I don't know that they usually appear in the Shapiro.
Well, I'll offer this. What is the intersection between, if there is one, between a public figure's personal life and his or her performance as an elected official? Seems to me that is probably where one starts. Many years ago, 1987, when Chuck Robb was governor, actually he had left the governorship, he was getting ready to run for the Senate, there were a series of stories about his after-hours activities in Virginia Beach.
Right.
The Times-Dispatch broke that story, but the Times-Dispatch, while we were hearing stories about how the governor, the former governor, might have comported himself, we kind of pushed that to the side. Our interest was that there was a criminal investigation, a federal criminal investigation going on in Hampton Roads, and that individuals were testifying before a federal grand jury on the appearance of the governor at parties at which illegal activities allegedly were taking place. That wasn't a tough story to write.
Yes.
But I think there was a demonstrated, if you will, intersection. That seems to me the test as well, now almost 30 years later.
Well, since you did put me on the spot, I'll go ahead and make one other comment before we move on. There are those of us that appreciate the Shapiro way of looking at this, and you're joined by some colleagues as well who do the similar matter and address it as you do, and instead of a blog that can become almost like the gossip page that one can turn to. So thank you, sir. Let me move on to another matter before our time runs out. Should certainly get your comments about 2016, how you see some elections going or some other issues that you think are very going to be hot in the General Assembly. Let me just toss out an open-ended to see what else you'd like to bring up before we get signals that our time has run out.
Well, 2016, of course, is going to be a presidential
Yes.
year, and watch Governor McAuliffe. He's a member of the Clinton Privy Council. He remains publicly confident that Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic presidential nominee. He will be, as well, head of the National Governors Association in 2016. So he'll be in an unusually
Yes.
high-profile position, not just to talk about Hillary Clinton, but about the bigger federal issues and how they apply to the states with Democratic governors as well as Republican governors. So even as McAuliffe is focusing on that important budget, again, the fiscal foundation of his legacy, he's going to be very busy as well with national affairs.
Joe, Assembly Session 2016, Confederate symbols, guns, other issues that will be, whether or not legislation passes, certainly will be introduced. What are some other hot button issues that you're seeing here in the fall?
Well, one wonders if some of the passions will cool after the election, in that many of these men and women will have been reelected, and the urgency to press some of these issues may fade. So, for example, after the decision by the Supreme Court this year to legalize same-sex marriage border to border, one has heard from the Republican legislative leadership, principally the Speaker, Bill Howell. He, I guess, howls with some indignation over some provision in state law that would protect religious institutions from having to sanction same-sex marriage. Is this something that Republicans will feel passionately about come January? So I would suggest to you that between the election and the first weeks of January, when the legislature comes in, maybe some things will fall by the wayside. I don't know about firearms control. The governor has certainly talked a lot about it following the tragedy, the WDBJ tragedy. One expects that there will be yet another push for some type of restriction, this so-called universal background check, but one can also anticipate largely, almost entirely Republican resistance on that.
Jeff, thank you so much for being on This Week in Richmond, and we'd remind our viewers that if they are seeing another Shapiro name in the Times-Dispatch that relates to food, That's the one that you are spouse with, and they'll follow you on Twitter and on your columns. And we look forward to having another conversation with you here on This Week in Richmond. We thank you.
Thank you, David.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources, a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward.
Haley Buick GMC in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.